Good evening, everybody, and welcome to US in the City. Tonight, I'm very excited indeed. We have a fantastic guest with us. We have Dame Louise Ellman DBE, who served as Member of Parliament for Liverpool Riverside from 1997 to 2019, and she was a member of the Labour Party until her resignation in October 19, in the run-up to the general election, when Labour was marred by its anti-Semitism scandal. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with Louise this evening, who is an esteemed politician, a lovely person, and has a great story to tell about a life in politics and all of her insights. So can't wait to speak to her. Louise, are you there?
I'm here. Hello. Hello. Very nice to be with you.
Lovely to see you. And I wanted to say it's been a mad year, a mad 14 months, really. And it's great to be able to connect with you. Hopefully you've been well.
Yes, I've been fine, thank you. And COVID has made everything difficult for everyone, but we've been fine, thanks.
Good. Okay. So I thought we'd begin our interview this evening at the sort of beginning of your story. And could you give us a bit of background into where you came from and what your early influences were, what your family was like, and just give us a flavor of Louise as a child and what influenced you at that time of your life?
Well, I'm from Manchester, and I grew up with my parents and my younger sister. We were a reasonarly happy family, I think. The usual issues arose. My father was very much what I used to see as an armchair socialist. He saw himself as a working class person. He was very committed to socialism. He was very interested in equality, very upset when he thought people were being treated badly. But it always struck me, he spoke a lot about this, but nothing much seemed to be done. My mother always liked to challenge, and she challenged my father on his ideas, but I think she just liked to challenge people generally. And she always used to say to me, never just go along with something because that's what everyone else is doing. Always ask, always inquire. And so I think I used to listen to my father. I always liked what he said. I didn't really like it when my mother challenged him, but it used to just make me think a little bit. And we were from a family of very modest means, but I think very aspirational in terms of education. And we were always encouraged in education at home, both my sister and myself. And we both won scholarships to secondary schools. At that time, there were schools called direct grant schools. They don't exist anymore. And we were always encouraged to learn and to develop our ideas. I think those are very much the influences on us. When I was about 13, I think it was, I joined Habonim, and I was very interested there. But now I think back on it, I think really quite ironic that I was never all that interested in the Zionism, but I was very interested in the idea of kibbutzim, which was the real focus of Habonim. But I very much like the socialist ideas and all the discussions that we used to have with very interesting people. So that used to interest me as well. So I think that's something about my background.
And so you came from a Jewish family in Manchester, who had originally come to this country from Lithuania?
Yes, my parents were born here. My grandparents came, 3 of my 4 grandparents came from different countries, yes, from Lithuania and from Russia. My maternal grandmother came from St. Petersburg, and I grew up being told that her parents were tailors to the Tsar. And I think in my mind as a child, I thought they were the tailors to the Tsar. It was only years later I realised the Tsar had many tailors, so that was their background. And my paternal grandfather was actually born in this country, but his parents came here from the German-Polish border. So 3 of my 4 grandparents came from outside this country.
So I wanted to ask, in terms of when you were growing up and you were forming your political ideology and your thoughts, did that influence your university career or what you chose to do at university at all?
Yes, I think it did. I studied sociology, and I did history with that, but my main interest was always in sociology, and I saw that as a way of studying power relations and the structure of society, and that was very much driven by the ideas as I was developing at that time.
Okay. And so you grew up, went to university, had an aspiration for education, and then what happened to drag you into the political realm? Was there a moment where you felt, I want to be a professional politician?
I don't think I ever thought of myself in that way, except that I always had a general idea that I wanted to change things and that I wanted society to be different. And I think I had the vaguest idea about how that would happen and exactly how I'd be involved. But I imagined transforming society, and I hated anything to do with inequality, and I hated anything to do with racism. And somehow that drove me. But after I finished university, I was married to my husband, Jeff, who's been a terrific support to me all this time. We then spent a year in Israel, and we came back to this country, and we lived in Leeds for a time, and then we went to live in the new town of Skelmersdale. It was a new town at that point, and being built to relieve overcrowding in Liverpool. And in that town, there were obviously lots of things that needed doing. And I'd been a member of the Labour Party for a long time. I joined it when I was 18. And in that new town, there was a vacancy in the Labour Party for a councillor, a member to go on Lancashire County Council. And the other members of the Labour Party asked me if I was interested. And I think that's the first time I thought about a practical application of my ideas. And I haven't thought about it at all since then. And I said, Lancashire County Council, where does that meet? And they said, it's in Preston, and you go to a meeting every month. I thought that didn't sound quite right, but I put my name forward, and I became elected. I became, at that time, was the youngest member of Lancashire County Council. And when I got there, I found that lots of people thought, well, they didn't like a woman being there. There weren't many women at that time acting in politics, and this was 1970. And they thought I was too young, and people used to shout out to me, and one in particular once called out to me, "Go home, young woman." Another person sent me a message saying, "Don't speak in your first term of office." Well, that seemed ridiculous to me. I'd gone there to fight for facilities for the new town that I represented, and it needed nurseries, it needed a library, it needed proper schools, needed transport. And so I think it was at that point that I realised that I could do so much more to bring change by being involved with other people and with the resource of a local authority than I could as an individual. And that was the beginning of how I became involved in practical politics. And I didn't go home, as I was asked to do. I stayed on there. And 11 years later, that's 1981, I actually became the leader of Lancashire County Council, and I stayed as leader there until 1997. And it was in those years that I really started to understand how you could use the resource, use support of other people, staffing resources, the power that being elected gives you, working with other people, to really make changes. And it was probably in those years that I think that my mind then maybe moved a bit from thinking worldwide and moved into how I could make changes for people I was representing in the area where I was. And I think those were probably very decisive years, and probably specifically the years from when I first got on the county council in 1970, when I became the leader of the opposition Labour group in 1974. 1974 to 81, I think that's when I really started to understand how you can make a difference to people's lives.
And then you were elected as an MP.
Yes, I was. I was leader in Lancashire County Council. We did many very exciting things. We set up an office in Brussels. We brought millions of pounds into Lancashire to redevelop its rundown industries, to regenerate rundown areas. We did very important environmental work. We set up an enterprise agency working with the private sector, public and private sector together. Very controversial at the time, not at all controversial now, finding ways of investing in our community. And I really loved doing that. And then in the 1990s, probably about 1995, I was approached by somebody I knew in Liverpool. It was a trade union officer. And as I'd always worked across the Northwest, I always thought regionally, and I was interested in the Northwest region. And he said to me, there's going to be a vacancy in Liverpool. One of the members of Parliament is going to stand down. And I and some others wondered if you'd like to put your name forward for it. And it was at that point I thought, well, should I? I thought, I don't really want to be an MP. So I've met quite a lot of MPs during the years I've been involved in local government, and I hadn't liked them very much. I often clashed with them. They seemed to me to know very little, trying to tell me what I should do, which I would never listen to, and told them I knew what was good for Lancashire, not them. And I thought, well, I've been in Lancashire all this time, maybe I'm running out of steam, and maybe it is time to try and do something different. So I put my name forward. I didn't put that much effort into things, but I liked the idea of Liverpool. People in the Northwest were always looking down at Liverpool at that point, and that made me sympathetic to them. And being in Skelmersdale, lots of Liverpool people. So I liked Liverpool, put my name forward, and then I actually got selected. It was actually an all-women's seat, and I got selected there, and I stayed selected until what happened to me a couple of years ago now, and I became MP for Liverpool Riverside. And so that's really how it happened. It certainly wasn't a wish to be an MP. I always wanted to make a difference and become involved in local government, saw what that could do. Then with the opportunity to be a Member of Parliament, I think probably because it was Liverpool, I put my name forward and was very lucky in being selected at that particular time. And that was 1995.
Wow. And you said before that you weren't so into Zionism as a child, but you became the chair of the Jewish Labour movement for 10 years. How did that happen?
Well, I was always interested in Jewish issues, but I don't think I ever saw myself as somebody only interested in Jewish things. I was interested in lots of universal issues, but I always had an interest in Israel and in social justice. And I've been a member of PZ, Zion, which had been the precursor of the Jewish Labour movement, and that was part of the Labour Party, an affiliate to the Labour Party. I'd always been a member of that, and I'd supported Israel there and supported lots of issues, and race relations legislation, which was a relatively new thing then, and lots of things that I saw connected with Jewish ethics and Jewish values. And in Parliament, once I was in Parliament, although I hadn't seen myself as what I'd now call a Jewish MP, I suddenly started to realise how hostile, or sometimes just ignorant, lots of people who I was connected with politically were about issues that particularly affected Jewish people. And even going back quite a long time, I came across people who were fervent anti-racists, or so they said, but knew very little about antisemitism, unless it came from fascists. They understood that, but they didn't understand it in any other way. So that drew me more and more to issues involved with Jewish things. And I became involved in Parliament in PZ, and then it was decided to have a name change and change the name of PZ to the Jewish Labour Movement. And that was because over the years, so few people understood what Zion was, workers of Zion. It wasn't really understood, and the name was changed, and I became the chair of it. We used to meet in Parliament. And at that time, members were really going down. It had a much older membership, maybe people who'd been connected in the past. But once we'd formed the Jewish Labour Movement, and then a lot of newer, younger people joined, that gave it new impetus, new membership. And then when the problems of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party developed, clearly the Jewish Labour Movement had a very vital role to play, and it's still playing it.
So as things progressed and you became more senior, and did you notice a fundamental shift in the Labour Party? I'm talking before Corbyn. Is it that just Corbyn and the problem with the Jews? appeared with Corbyn, or was it building up for some years beforehand?
Yes, I think it was. I think there had always been some anti-Semitism on the left of politics, and I've come across it many years ago, not particularly in the Labour Party, but in organisations which were to the left of the Labour Party, more revolutionary in their outlook. And I came across people who would say things that I thought were anti-Semitic, and they would say, oh, no, we're just anti-Zionist. And I think that's how I first came across it. And I noticed it at first in the 1970s, 1980s. I think it was all post the Six-Day War, when suddenly Israel was seen as the occupier and all-powerful, and there was a shift of opinion. And somehow the anti-Zionism, I always felt, morphed into anti-Semitism. But that wasn't a big problem in the Labour Party, although I think it was an issue in far-left groups. And by then I wasn't interested in any of those groups. I think I could see them for what they were. And the Labour Party had this element in it, but it wasn't dominant until the Corbyn years. So I would say it wasn't new when Jeremy Corbyn arrived. It was always around there. But it was when Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party and brought with him that far left way of thinking, that strand of Labour anti-Semitism became much more dominant and eventually became very powerful. So I'd say that was the difference. It existed before, but it was fringe. It came to the centre with Jeremy Corbyn.
So doctrinally, in terms of ideology, you talked about, the idea of the social justice element to politics and seeing the world as people who are oppressed or people who are oppressing them. I guess a kind of the way that Karl Marx describes it in his writings, and I guess you identified with that kind of ideology. How do you think anti-Semitism crept into that system of thinking?
I think it came from people, and again, mainly on the far left, who held very, what I would call, they would see as pure, I put in inverted commas, theoretical positions. And they saw and see the world often in a very stark way. People who are all powerful, who hold power, who control movements, control capital, and people who are subjected to that and are slaves to capital, whose life is determined by decisions made by people who are all powerful. And those theories became mixed up, confused with, intermingled with, what I call old-style anti-Semitism, that Jews are an international group, very powerful, work for their own ends across the world, are the arch-capitalists. And those two strands merged together with too many people. And I think that is where all this came from. And then in the Labour Party, when this way of thinking started to be normalised, I think that other people who perhaps weren't in that category at all, but who had perhaps picked up the odd anti-Semitic thought in their lives, have just heard comments from people, not thought much about it, suddenly thought it was okay to voice the things that they thought. And that's why there were suddenly so many comments on social media, but elsewhere too, about the Rothschilds and about powerful Jews. But some realised if they said Jews, that really wouldn't go down very well. So it became Zionists. And Zionism was then seen as a form of what they describe as capitalist imperialism, suppressing indigenous peoples. And that is how many people who were involved in that way of thinking think about life. And I think it was highly theoretical positions that came together. And of course, real life, well, it is wrong in essence, it is just a wrong way of thinking. But I think that's really is how it arose and was picked up by so many people, often not realising what they were doing.
It's fascinating. And as in parenthesis, I'd like to tell all the viewers, if they'd like to post any questions for Louise, we can try and pick them up at the end of the interview. There's a comment section on this format and also on Facebook Live, and all the comments and the questions will come to me on my screen here. So just saying that en passant. But I'd like to explore this further with you, Louise, that, you know, as a Jewish woman, you don't have to wear one of these things on your head in order to get through the day like I do. So I guess you're not necessarily overtly Jewish in mainstream society. If you don't want to be, you'd have to announce that. But did you experience yourself any incidents of abuse, anti-Jewish abuse against you personally?
Well, many years ago, when people really didn't know that I was Jewish, I would sometimes hear anti-Semitic comments. They weren't meant against me personally, but they were just comments made. And I at first, I think I was just taken aback, didn't quite know what to do. And then I found a way of challenging them by asking people to explain what they meant. And I just remember one particular event, and this is going back a long, long way. Somebody, it was at a Labour meeting, said to me something about it was somebody talking about the need to raise money and how hard it was to raise funds and get money out of people. And this person said to me, "Oh, they're not all at the Wailing Wall, you know." And I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And this person looked at me a bit askance and then started to say, well, the Jews, you know. And then maybe suddenly realised something and looked at me and looked embarrassed. And I said, well, and then finished this story about me and Jews. And I said, well, I'm Jewish. What do you mean? You think I'm mean? And then this guy was so embarrassed, he just wanted to go away. So I had one or two listeners, but not really very much. And perhaps the occasional incident, but nothing much at all, nothing that made much impression on me. But of course, it all changed once the Jeremy Corbyn saga began, and it became very different then, when people did know I was Jewish, and some awful things were said, but it was usually to do with Zionist, not Jew, but the two were interchangeable.
Yes, and I guess this reached a crescendo in 2019. I'd like to go there.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of early October. And how did this motion of no confidence in you come about? Forgive me, I'm not so au fait with the facts there.
Yeah. Well, the pressure against me had really been building up from the time that Jeremy Corbyn became leader. I'd been an MP in Liverpool then for about 20 years, nearly 20 years, not quite that. And I really had a wonderful relationship with my local Labour Party, with the members in it. Had all sorts of discussions. I never missed the Labour Party meeting, and I never did, in fact, until the time I left. And we had discussions, debates, very good relationship indeed, excellent. And it's all changed when Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader. The membership of the local Labour Party, Liverpool Riverside, grew dramatically from around 500 to 2,700. And the nature of the meetings changed. The new people who came announced themselves. They'd only joined because of Jeremy Corbyn. Some were returning members of what had been the militant tendency. Others had been in different kinds of fringe left-wing groups. They came to meetings, not the 2,700, but 200 or 300, which is quite a lot of people at a meeting when we used to get 30, 40 perhaps. And the meetings started to change their nature. And the meetings became, in the words of supporters of mine who later complained to the Labour Party, like a torture chamber where I was interrogated meeting after meeting. And it was all to do with Israel and Zionism. One question about how could I be elected by a democratic political party of this country, yet represent a fascist government abroad? Well, know what that meant. Another one, Israel funded ISIS. So would I change my policy on wanting to attack ISIS in Syria in case it hurt an Israeli soldier? That's just two examples. And meeting after meeting around me. But I didn't want to go, and I didn't want to, what I saw, give in to it. And I used to stand my ground and answer each of these questions, meeting after meeting. And it got so dreadful that in the end, complaints were made to the Labour Party nationally. Some secret documents were exposed, which showed a very well organised momentum plot to get rid of me. And they said from the beginning I was their target, I was to go, because I was a Zionist, that was the crime. They never complained about how I represented people in Liverpool. I was a Zionist, that was it. And of course, I didn't give in to them. I dug in, and I got worse. And I made sure I raised questions on Israel in Parliament after every meeting, so they wouldn't think they were going to stop me. In the end, the momentous plot to get rid of me was exposed. There was a Labour Party investigation, and some changes were made. And then once this has been exposed, and by then the newcomers were running the Labour Party, they somehow got most of the others to go away by using various unpleasant tactics. And they realised they'd have to be a bit more careful. And they didn't attack me openly in meetings, so they were still plotting to get rid of me and awful things were going on outside. But they started a campaign of what they called dehumanising me. And many members wouldn't use my name. They ignored me as much as they could. And if they had to call me anything, it was Mrs. Ellman, which you probably realise is not a way you normally would address your MP in the Labour Party, or the MP. And it was a very nasty campaign. But I kept going every time, and I went through it, challenged people when I could. Things came to a head as we were getting nearer to what was rumoured to be a general election likely to be called. And I stood my ground, and I kept being told I was going to be deselected, they were going to get rid of me. I knew it was quite likely that there wouldn't be time for any procedure when that could happen. And the Labour Party might well have, which in the end they did, just say anybody who was currently a Labour MP would be able to stand again. So the members actually couldn't get rid of you. They kept telling me that they would. I kept coming to the meetings. And I then went to Labour Party conference, and I spoke at a fringe meeting of Labour Friends of Israel, and I was the chair of it at that time. And I repeated all the things I'd said about the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn, nothing I hadn't said before. When I went to the next meeting of the local Labour Party, there were a lot more people than usual there, and all the faces, grim. People looked down as I came in, glared at me, came in front, and then challenged me about what I'd said at the Labour Friends of Israel fringe meeting. And I said, well, yes, I've said this, and you've heard this. I'm very surprised that you've taken aback by this. I've told you this before, I've said it in public before, and I've said it to you. Well, they were outraged, and then one of them said, we don't want to talk about all this antisemitism stuff, so-called. We like to talk about poverty and the health service. And I thought, what kind of place am I in here? Is this the Labour Party? You choose, you don't want to talk about racism, that's what anti-Semitism was, and somehow other issues are something different. And I said, I'm very surprised you say that. I thought I was in the Socialist Party, and racism's a very big concern. So is the health service, so is equality. How can you have to choose? Well, there was uproar when I said that. A few people cheered me, but not many. Most like that, very, very grim. So I left that meeting thinking, do I really want to stay in a place like this with all these truly dreadful people? And the party nationally, of course, was as it was, and I was feeling increasingly concerned. And at that point, I thought, well, I don't really think Labour's going to win any general election here, but suppose there was a minority government. At that stage, it was just about possible. I don't think ever really realistic. And suppose Jeremy Corbyn ended up leading it, and I thought, well, the Lib Dems are extremely weak. They would never stand up to him, really, when it came to it. The Scottish National Party are only interested in independent Scotland. If he agreed he'd have a referendum, they'd go along with anything. And I suddenly in my mind thought, suppose he ended up, even for a short time, at number 10. And what would happen? Anti-Semitism would become part of the government. The others would just be too weak to fight against it. I wouldn't trust them. And I want to be part of this. And I started to suddenly feel this all coming together. And I thought, I don't really think I want to. But all the time, I didn't want to do what I saw as giving into what was happening. I wanted to keep fighting it. And then I heard that a vote of no confidence had been tabled to be debated against me in one of the local branches. It was on Colnidre, that's when it was going to be debated. And you know, sometimes suddenly you're thinking of things for a long time, and something happens, and then you just know. And I suddenly thought, no, I just cannot bear to be in this any longer. And I'm going to go. And that's really how the whole thing happened. And it was their attempt really to what they would call deselect me, get rid of me as a Labour candidate. In the event, if I hadn't done that, as some of my friends said to me afterwards, they said, you know, you should have not done that, because you would have been reinstated as the Labour candidate for the general election. The local parties, in the end, didn't have the chance to get rid of anybody they didn't like. But by then, I really just did not want to. I didn't want to be anything to do with it anymore. And so I went. So that's really what happened at the end. But it all started when Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader.
So essentially, at the beginning, you thought, I'll stick this out. I'm not going to let these people intimidate me and force me out. But by the end, it was so toxic that it would have been unthinkable to have stayed with those people.
That's how I felt it. Yes, it all came together, and it was toxic. I can remember now how I felt looking around that room at that final meeting that I went to. And I looked at the people around the room, and you know, there were always a few people who supported me, but they became fewer as time went on. And I looked at most of the people in the room and the faces and the feeling and knowing what they were about and what they were. And I thought, I just don't want to be with these people anymore. And then it was the imminence of the general election as well. And I thought, just suppose Jeremy Corbyn is in a powerful position and anti-Semitism becomes really mainstream. And by then I'd seen how quickly things had changed in the Labour Party. And it was things that I knew about theoretically, and I knew what had happened. You know, I knew about the rise of Nazi Germany. I knew all about all of these things. But I'd never seen before myself how quickly things could change. And I saw how quickly an organisation which was fine, where there was no problem, was changed by the arrival of a group of people who knew exactly what they were about and set about change. And I saw how, at the beginning, a lot of people objected. And as they saw that there was a new power in the land, a lot of people went quieter. Some went away altogether. Some still spoke out, but they were fewer and fewer, and a different atmosphere came. And I just saw how quickly something very bad could happen. And I think that was part of what affected me as well. But when I decided to leave, and once I decided I was going to do it, as traumatic as I found it, and I think really I still do, I thought I wanted to do it so that I spelt out very publicly why I was doing it. And I think for the first time in my life, I really did not want Labour to win. And I couldn't bring myself to vote for someone else. I really hadn't changed my allegiances at all, but I knew it would be highly dangerous for Jewish people and for the country if Labour had won at that time.
I thank God for all the British citizens who didn't vote him in.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how significant it was that they chose Kol Nidre night to be the deselection day. Do you think that they'd opened up their luach and found the day?
Well, I was asked this at the time by somebody on a television interview on the regional TV who asked me that question, and I don't know if they knew, or if they had known, would they have cared? I doubt if they knew at the time they did it, but they did know soon afterwards, because I spoke about it. And I'd only realised myself when I saw that this motion had been tabled. Don't suppose I looked at the date. And then I thought to myself, oh well, if they're going to do that, I must get a few people I knew in the area concerned who told me they'd stay in the Labour Party to support me, didn't really want to go to meetings, but if they were ever needed, they would turn up. So I thought, I'll phone up these people and see if they'll go. And then I looked properly at the date and looked at my diary, and then, of course, I realised. And then after I said publicly that's the date it was on, that motion was not withdrawn. It was only withdrawn some days later, after I understand they'd had frantic phone calls from Jeremy Corbyn's office by then, sort of begging them to withdraw this, because they realised how damaging this looked. So I don't know if they knew, I don't know if they cared. and I don't know if they knew the significance, but by then I didn't care about them, and I had to go.
Wow. Once again, I've got a few questions in now. If anyone does want to submit questions for Louise, please do so, and I will try and get through them at the end. I wanted to home in on the current state of affairs. There's a new leader of the Labour Party now, obviously in the form of Keir Starmer. How do you think he's doing in terms of leadership of the Labour Party, in terms of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and what do you think of the rumours that have come out about leadership challenges?
On anti-Semitism, I think he is trying very hard to deal with the issue, and he has taken very significant steps in addressing it. On the day he was elected leader, he actually phoned me up and he said that he saw as his top priority dealing with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and that he hoped that I would feel able to rejoin. And I said to him what I've said many times since, that the Labour Party is my political home, and if anti-Semitism is dealt with, I will go back to it, but it has to be when it has been dealt with. I think he has been dealing with things, and I think he's had problems because the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, and that's the policy-making body who he reports to, which has quite a lot of power because Jeremy Corbyn gave it more power than it used to have, and it can block things the leader wants to do. And at the beginning, soon after Keir Starmer was elected, was still controlled by people who supported Corbyn, who would have opposed Starmer on dealing toughly with anti-Semites. But that has now started to change. The elections last year changed it quite a bit, but it needs to change more. So I think that accounts for his slow start. But a number of people have gone from the Labour Party. Anti-Semitism no longer comes from the top. It did come from the top before. And Keir Starmer is very clear that this is wrong and he won't accept it. But there's still more to do in local Labour parties, and there are too many local Labour parties where people who are involved in anti-Semitic things are still around, and I think more of them have to be dealt with. So I'd say Keir Starmer is very genuine. He has already changed the whole atmosphere, and people now who start to say anti-Semitic things are clamped down on, are suspended, but he has to do more. But he's genuine and he is doing this. The whole atmosphere is different now. If you're an anti-Semite now, I don't think you'll go naturally into the Labour Party. You'll be too worried you get found out. Before, I think that was rather different. So it's different, but needs to do more on some of the local parties. And in general terms, I think getting the Labour Party back to being electable is a pretty long job. And I think the Labour Party became very toxic and became very alien to a lot of people who had previously supported it. And I think Keir Starmer is trying to tackle that, but I think he needs more time. And I think that after trying to deal with the things which were very difficult and very toxic, he has to find a way now of coming forward with ideas and proposals which interest people and enthuse them. And I think people vote for a political party. It's not just the policies they put forward. They have to believe that they're credible and that the party is going to deliver and going to do something good. So for me, it's not just a matter of a list of things that sound good. People have to believe in you and think that you're going to do it. I mean, after all, you can promise the earth, but people will know that's not true, so they won't vote for you. They've got to believe in you, and that's a longer job. And in terms of leadership challenges, I think if the Corbynites had a challenger they thought was credible and they thought had a chance of winning, they would have come forward with that person now. And they didn't, so they don't think they have. But they haven't gone away, although they're weakened, and they may be biding their time. So I think that the elections to the National Executive Committee that will be held in September of this year are very important ones, and it needs more people who will support Starmer and the Change Labour Party to get onto that top policy-making committee to give him more support to do more things. So I think Starmer has to look behind his back all the time, be wary, know there are always people who might want to challenge you, and it might come from all sides. But above all, he has to keep dealing with getting rid of the toxicity of Labour, but also developing ideas with other people which do relate to the future, which people can identify with.
Thank you. I mean, I find it a tall order, I guess, in theory, because you spoke about the 2,700, you talked about momentum, and you talked about the hundreds, if not thousands, of radical anti-Semitic leftists that have joined the party. I guess how can one leader? Is it that those people will recoil away from the Labour Party, or that there's a more compelling narrative, or what could he possibly do?
Some of the people who joined Labour because of Jeremy Corbyn have gone now. And they thought they were going to have an easy ride to power, that they would be all powerful. And some of those have gone because they can see now that something's happened. It didn't go according to plan, and they've gone elsewhere. But they've not all gone. There are some still there, and they think that they are fighting for the true soul of the Labour Party. And one of the things they press Starmer on is policy, and they say to Keir Starmer, well, you came to the leadership because you said you keep to the policies Jeremy Corbyn put forward. Now you've got to do it. Well, of course, Keir Starmer's saying, I'm looking to the future, I'm not looking to the past. So some of those people may go, but they haven't all gone. And they're stronger in some areas than others. And the trade unions are another area because they are powerful as well. And there are changes in the offing on who becomes the General Secretary of some major unions. So whoever that is could be decisive as well. And we just don't know what the outcome of those elections might be. But I think some of the people who were most pro-Jeremy Corbyn have started to move away, and there'll always be some areas, and I suspect Liverpool is one of them, where those people stay around longer than other areas because they think that they're fighting the good fight and they're not giving in. But it's a challenge, but you know, leaders have to face challenges, that's what they're there for.
Right. I've got a question here from Angela Roscoe, who says, do you think the Labour Party will ever improve?
I think it will, but it will take time, and it won't come automatically, and it needs good leadership, and it needs people to stay with it and to give it a chance. But I think it will happen. I think the government at the moment is in a particularly strong position, and COVID has changed a lot of things. It's changed the situation. People are looking very much at recovery, and I think it's putting the government in a good light rather than in a bad light. And because of the current situation, it's led to a very strongly conservative government talking in ways previous conservative governments didn't talk, and saying things like, we'll pay out we'll spend what it takes to get things right. That didn't used to be the way a conservative government spoke. So let's see how that develops. I think we're in a very unusual situation at the moment, which makes it hard for any opposition. But I think that Labour has to get rid of its toxicity. Now, I think that is happening now. So I think that's the first thing that's going on. But then it's to do with being positive and having ideas as enthused people. So I think it will come right, but it won't be tomorrow or even the day after.
Right. I've got a question here from Jonathan Metlis, who says, how can Keir Starmer say that Israel is breaching international law at the moment with the current conflict? Does that not stir up more anti-Semitism, which he has been said to be committed to fighting against?
Well, the comments about international law are not being said just by Keir Starmer, and they're being said by a lot of other people as well. And it appears to rest on issues that we've heard before, so the last Gaza war happened, and other issues as well, on what is proportionate defence. You know, the idea Israel has a right to defend itself, but it has to be proportionate. I remember very clearly, not more than 4 years ago now, the last Gaza incident, little war, it's not an incident, is it? when people would say that far more Palestinians in Gaza were killed than Israelis, therefore Israel's action was disproportionate. It's not. It's proportionate to dealing with the threat. I think Israel is looking at dismantling capability, not as well as an immediate threat, and the fact the Iron Dome's there is preventing very large numbers of Israeli civilians being killed. So that appears to be the area that this comment about international law is being made. But it's not just something Keir Starmer's picks up. I've heard others say it. And sometimes in issues and disputes about whether Israel is or isn't breaking international law, I sometimes feel that the people who don't agree Israel's breaking international law have much quieter voices than those that say it will. So I wish those voices would be louder too. And I suspect this is a whole area where there is a lot of debate about what isn't the law and what the interpretation of the law is.
Yes, because the UN Charter clearly states that every nation has the right to self-defense when faced with military threat. And I guess, yeah, it is a worrying situation. I think in Anglo Jewry at the moment, when we saw my good colleague Rabbi Rafi Goodwin, who was attacked in his community, anti-Semitic comments were apparently said, allegedly, and it's very frightening for people when they read these stories, and also the cars that I know that drove through Manchester and London with pro-Palestinians shouting obscenities, openly racist slurs against Jews and threats against Jews, misogynistic and violently racist terminology. I guess now would be the time for our political leaders to speak up the most. It's very strange to comprehend the level of racism so prevalent, and especially in anti-Semitic terms in 2021. And what do you think could be done to address some of this unpleasantness, and especially at this time in our history?
I think that much stronger action should be taken against people who are clearly committing offences. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen to the people who drove the car, again, allegedly from Bradford. I don't know if that's true, but came through Manchester in Jewish areas and into London Jewish areas shouting obscenities. And they've now been arrested, I understand. Well, they should be charged. It shouldn't just be a word that you hear of. There was a policewoman I saw in the demonstration who was supposed to be keeping order at the demonstration in London, who started shouting out pro-Palestine statements. She's now supposed to be under investigation. Well, something should be done about that. I think that when these incidents happen, action has to be taken, not just a tut-tutting. If they're breaking the law, proper action should be taken so that people, Jewish people and others, can feel more protected, because it's very, very frightening if incidents like this are allowed to become acceptable and something that people can do. They are actually against race hate laws, but they have to be acted on and enforced.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to share one small experience personally. When I just got married, I was living in Israel, in Jerusalem, and I think I've been living there for a week as a married man. I had prayed in shul, and on the way home, I was going back to my little newlywed apartment for with my wife for breakfast. I was walking with a friend of mine, also English, from Hertfordshire, and he lived in an apartment one road beyond mine. And I went home, he carried on. We heard a huge bang, and a Palestinian suicide bomber had blown up a civilian occupied bus. Body parts had flown in front of my friend. I saw him later that day. He was white as a sheet. He had to go for therapy immediately because of the trauma of seeing these things. And it is horrific for those who have to live through this type of thing. And I just, I guess, I think on the whole of our community are worried about what's going on in Israel and also the repercussions here. I remember when I was a rabbi at Richmond Synagogue in southwest London, we had to have a police van constantly situated in our shul car park because of the threats and the abuse that we were getting, even though we are, as a community, we had no direct involvement in Israel and didn't have any responsibility for government policy in Israel. But it seems to be, as you said before, Zionism and anti-Semitism very much intermingled or interplaced. And I guess lots of fear. What would you say to people who are fearful about what's going on in society right now?
Well, I certainly understand why people are afraid, and I think I feel maybe fear is not the right word, sort of foreboding when I can see what's developing and I watch the television screen and I can see why people get the reactions they do, and you look at me and you see truly horrible pictures of homes in Gaza destroyed and children being buried and families destroyed, which is awful. And then it switches to Israel, where you see people walking down the street or maybe going into a shelter. They don't even show that very much. So it looks as if one side's fine and the other side's in trouble. Because without the Iron Dome, you'd have all the Israelis killed as well. And it's all come from Hamas terrorist organisation with Iran behind it, but you don't see that. I think I'd say to people, I know that we feel concerned, but we've got to carry on and we've got to keep putting the right case. We haven't got to hide and run away and be afraid, except for taking normal care and be glad of organisations like the Community Security Trust who do such a great job. But I don't think we must withdraw into ourselves and be scared to speak. But I realise it's all very well to say that, but people do feel worried. And where people are in public places, we do deserve public protection. And very sadly, it's become normal for certainly Jewish schools and Jewish public places to have guards there. And that has been normal for a long time. It is dreadful, it has been normal, that will have to continue. But it is very worrying, I agree, but we shouldn't lose confidence in ourselves. We are right, but we just have to recognise what's there. And all of us do want a solution, and we do want peace. We do want a ceasefire, when one can be negotiated. And we do want a peaceful solution to the conflict, as difficult as that is. And I think we have to keep calling for that. But we're not responsible for anything. And people in this country are looking at what's happening with different degrees of involvement and concern. But we mustn't be afraid and withdraw into ourselves. That wouldn't be right.
Do you think that you might return to politics, or have you gone away and not willing to come back?
Well, I kind of left, but actually I watch it as much. I probably watch Parliament on TV a lot more than I ever did before, when I was busy doing things instead of watching it. And I would like to go back to the Labour Party, but I won't do it until I feel more's been done and has been done up to now. But it's going the right direction, but not there yet. But I don't think I'll be back in elected politics. I think that has gone now. And but I still like to be part of trying to make society a bit better in some way or other. Not quite sure what way, or even if anything will happen. So that's all very vague, isn't it? I think that's how I think. But I'm still a political animal, really. But elected politics, no, I think that is finished. But I'd like to be able to do something in some way at some stage.
And you plan on staying in the UK?
Yes.
Well, great. It's great having you. And I really wanted to say thank you for being with us this evening. I think I've spoken to many politicians in my time, and you are probably one of the warmest, most genuine, most honest, and just a pleasure to speak to, really. And thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. A lot of people are saying how interesting they found the discussion on social media, and it's been really delightful. And I know that those times when you faced that pressure in politics must have been quite traumatic and stressful for you. So I hope that that's behind you and that you can move on with a smile. And thank you for all that you've done for society. And thank you for being with us tonight. So I'd like to say thank you, Louise.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to meet you, which is an absolute pleasure, and to be able to talk a little about things that happened to me, and hopefully between us all we can make life better for everyone.
Amen.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Louise.
Thank you.
And I'd like to say thank you to Hannah Rubin, who's been working on this, setting this up with all the logistics. Thank you to you, Hannah. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening live on social media and on the internet and US TV for this interview for US in the City. Wish you all a safe evening. Good night.